America loves bragging that it was built by immigrants. True. It just skips the part where those immigrants were humiliated, scammed, classified like livestock, and forced through rules so absurd they sound made up. So here are 32 of the weirdest, dumbest, and most unbelievable facts from US immigration history. 1. Everyone on Earth knows what a green card is supposed to be: the golden ticket to permanent residency in the United States. The problem is that for a huge chunk of its history, the government treated that name like a prank. The earliest versions actually were green, which made sense for about 5 minutes. Then officials changed the color and left the name behind like nobody would notice. For years, immigrants were carrying cards that were pink, blue, or plain white, while still being told, with a straight face, that this was their green card. Imagine explaining that to a boss, a landlord, or literally anyone with functioning eyesight. The branding disaster dragged on for more than half a century before the government finally had the stunning realization that maybe the green card should, in fact, be green. 2. Ellis Island medical checks were already nerve-wracking, but the eye exam was the part that made people internally scream. Doctors were hunting for trachoma, a contagious eye disease that could get you deported on the spot. And because apparently basic human comfort was not invited, they used a button hook to do it. Yes, the same metal tool people use to fasten tight little buttons on boots. A doctor would slide that cold hook under your eyelid and flip it inside out to inspect it. Thousands of immigrants got this treatment every single day. The truly disgusting part is that the hook was often just wiped on a towel between patients, which sounds less like medicine and more like a group infection event. So the terrifying possibility was not only failing the exam, but potentially catching something while taking it. 3. In the 1850s, anti-immigrant hysteria got so out of hand that it produced one of the strangest political movements in American history. The Native American Party, which had almost nothing to do with actual Native Americans, behaved less like a normal party and more like a nervous secret society. Members held private meetings, whispered like conspiracy addicts, and were instructed to give one absurd answer if anyone asked what they were doing. I know nothing. That became their entire personality. Reporters, rivals, curious citizens, everyone got the same blank-faced response. So when politicians were confronted over their anti-immigrant agenda, they basically answered like malfunctioning robots. It was a full political movement built around pretending not to know anything, which is honestly a little too on brand for politics. They became known as the Know-Nothings, which sounds insulting, except they basically picked it themselves. 4. Old immigration laws are often awful, but the Immigration Act of 1917 somehow managed to sound like it had been written by cruel children on a school bus. This was a serious federal law, and yet it openly barred entry to people labeled idiots, imbeciles, and morons. Those were not casual insults in that era. They were official medical categories, which is somehow even worse. Congress, judges, and doctors all treated these deeply offensive words like legitimate science, as if human intelligence could be measured with playground language and bad attitudes. Reading it now feels surreal, like the government passed legislation using vocabulary borrowed from a petty argument. It says a lot about early 20th century immigration policy. Harsh, pseudoscientific, and embarrassingly confident. The whole thing is a reminder that plenty of supposedly serious laws were built on junk science, fear, and a level of smug ignorance that deserves public shaming forever. 5. Imagine stepping outside for air and risking punishment because some random officer decided your face or body was too upsetting for public viewing. That was not a dystopian novel. In the late 19th century, several American cities passed what were literally called ugly laws. The name alone sounds like satire, but the laws were real and vicious. They made it illegal for people judged unsightly, deformed, or visibly disabled to appear in public places. And yes, this hit poor immigrants especially hard, including people injured in factories or living with disabilities. So after surviving the voyage, the poverty, and maybe a workplace disaster, you could still be fined or jailed for the crime of not looking pleasant enough. These laws stayed around for decades in some cities. It was basically government-approved cruelty dressed up as public order, because apparently the easiest thing to police was human existence. 6. The Cold War left behind a lot of strange legal fossils, and one of the weirdest is still sitting inside American immigration law like it pays rent. Under current rules, anyone who is or once was a member of the Communist Party can be blocked from getting permanent residency or citizenship. It does not matter if that membership happened decades ago, if it was required for school, or if joining was basically the only way to keep a job in your home country. The law still reacts as if every applicant is personally plotting the return of the Soviet Union. So, a harmless retiree with grandchildren can end up treated like a major ideological threat because of some old party card from another political system. It is one of those rules that feels frozen in a Red Scare time capsule, still alive, still enforced, and still pretending the calendar says 1985. 7. The Chinese Exclusion Act was designed to slam the door on Chinese laborers, but Chinese immigrants responded with one of the most impressive survival loopholes in immigration history. Since children of American citizens could still be admitted, a whole underground world of invented families appeared. Men in China bought forged papers claiming they were the sons of Chinese Americans already living in places like San Francisco. These immigrants became known as paper sons, which sounds almost gentle until you realize the pressure they lived under. To get through questioning, they had to memorize entire fake biographies, relatives, village streets, neighbors, houses, even where the local well stood. One wrong answer, one tiny hesitation, and the whole story collapsed. Then it was deportation. So getting into America turned into a brutal memory contest where your prize was a future and your penalty was being sent straight back under racist exclusion laws. 8. The immigration law of 1924 was racist in such a committed, bureaucratic way that even your passport could become basically decorative. The law created strict national quotas aimed at keeping out Asians and many Eastern Europeans, but officials did not stop at citizenship or birthplace. They went digging into ancestry. So a person could be born in London, speak flawless English, carry a British passport, and still get shoved into a tiny Chinese quota if inspectors decided their bloodline mattered more than their legal identity. In other words, your actual country could be ignored if the government did not like your family tree. That is how openly the system prioritized race. It was not just restrictive. It was built to mathematically enforce white supremacy with paperwork, charts, and official stamps. The message was brutally clear. In that system, who your grandparents were mattered more than where you were from. 9. At Ellis Island, not speaking English did not spare you from being judged. It just meant the judgment got even weirder. Inspectors still wanted to decide whether immigrants were mentally fit to enter, so their solution was to hand exhausted adults the kind of tasks that sound like they came from a child development toy box. Some were told to arrange puzzle blocks into patterns. Others were asked to draw shapes like a diamond from memory. Now picture the situation. You have just survived a miserable ocean crossing. You are sleep-deprived, terrified, probably dehydrated, and your whole future suddenly depends on whether you can sketch geometry with steady hands. If your line was shaky or your drawing looked off, officials could brand you mentally unfit and send you back. It was a life-changing decision made with all the nuance of a schoolroom test, and none of the mercy. 10. If American inspection at the coast looked too strict, many immigrants in the late 19th century found a ridiculously simple workaround. Do not arrive in America first, just go through Canada. Canadian ports were often easier to enter, and once you got there, heading south into the United States could be almost laughably uncomplicated. There were no giant barriers, no surveillance towers, no agents lurking behind every tree. In many places, you could take a train, walk through the woods, cross an invisible line, and suddenly you were in the United States. That was it. No dramatic movie soundtrack, no laser grid, just pine trees minding their own business. So while modern politics treats the border like an epic fortress problem, there was a time when crossing into America could feel more like an unplanned hiking trip. The original northern border setup was basically trust, vibes, and forest. 11. During the Civil War, the Union Army needed soldiers badly, and recruiters developed a strategy that was both efficient and morally disgusting: ambush immigrants at the docks. Ships would arrive in New York packed with Irish and German newcomers, who had barely even processed what country they were standing in. Before many of them found lodging, food, or even a translator, recruiters were already in their faces waving enlistment bonuses. Some of these men did not speak English and had no clear idea what they were signing. Then suddenly they were in uniform, holding rifles, and marching toward a war they had never planned to join. It was a brutal bait and switch. People came to America hoping for work and stability, and instead, some got scooped up as instant battlefield material. Welcome to the United States. Here is your bonus, your gun, and your very urgent appointment with organized national chaos. 12. Ellis Island served plenty of culture shock, but some of it arrived in edible form. One of the funniest examples involved ice cream. Charity workers sometimes offered new arrivals a scoop as a friendly treat, which sounds lovely until you remember that many immigrants from rural European villages had never seen ice cream before. So they looked at this pale, creamy lump and made a completely reasonable guess. Fancy butter. Very cold butter, yes, but still butter. Naturally, some started spreading it on dark bread and eating it like a dairy upgrade. You can almost picture the moment of total confusion when sweet vanilla hit instead of salty fat. Suddenly, American butter was not just cold. It was suspiciously delicious and weirdly dessert-shaped. For workers watching nearby, it must have been like witnessing a culinary misunderstanding in real time, complete with frozen bread, baffled faces, and nobody quite knowing how to explain dessert politely. 13. When the Great Depression wrecked the economy in the 1930s, plenty of Americans decided the easiest way to process unemployment was to blame Mexican immigrants. The result was the Mexican repatriation, a massive deportation campaign carried out by local and federal authorities. People were rounded up in public places, packed onto trains, and dumped across the southern border. Around 1 million people were deported during the panic. The most horrifying part is that historians estimate a huge portion, roughly 60%, were actually United States citizens by birth. So this was not just a crackdown on non-citizens. It was the government effectively exiling its own people because fear, xenophobia, and economic desperation had taken over the steering wheel. Families were shattered. Citizens were abandoned in a country some had never even seen. It is one of those chapters that proves panic can make a government act both cruelly and absurdly at the same time. 14. For years, American policy toward Cuban migrants operated with the kind of name that sounds made up by a bored game show producer: Wetfoot, Dryfoot. And somehow, the rule was exactly as ridiculous as it sounds. If the Coast Guard intercepted a Cuban migrant while the person was still in the water, even inches from shore, they could be sent back. But if that same person managed to touch dry land in Florida first, they could stay legally. So the entire system turned serious immigration policy into a frantic race against geography. People would dash through shallow water while authorities closed in, hoping to reach sand before being stopped. It reduced life-changing decisions to a literal foot placement contest. Lose in the water, get deported. Win on the beach, get a future. When government policy starts sounding like a playground rule invented during recess, maybe it deserves a second look. 15. The United States once had a law so sexist it managed to punish women for marriage with almost cartoonish cruelty. Under the Expatriation Act of 1907, an American woman who married a foreign man could automatically lose her United States citizenship. Just like that, she could become an alien in the country where she was born and raised, all because she signed a marriage certificate with the wrong passport involved. Meanwhile, if an American man married a foreign woman, his citizenship remained perfectly untouched. Of course it did. If the woman wanted her status back, she had to go through naturalization like a brand new immigrant, as if she had not spent her entire life in America already. The law was basically a government announcement that a woman's nationality was less her own identity and more an accessory hanging off her husband. Romance was allowed, apparently, but only if federal sexism approved the paperwork. 16. Most international borders involve fences, checkpoints, or at least someone looking mildly suspicious. Then there is the Haskell Free Library and Opera House, which treats the whole concept like an inside joke. Built in 1904 right on the line between the United States and Canada, the building literally straddles the border. A black stripe on the floor marks where one country ends and the other begins. So you can enter from Quebec, walk into the reading room, and end up sitting in Vermont without crossing through a normal border station at all. No passport booth, no interrogation, no dramatic stamp. Just books and carpet quietly violating expectations. The place even has 2 addresses and 2 phone numbers depending on which side you are on. It is one of the few buildings on Earth where moving your chair a few feet can technically make you an international traveler without even interrupting your reading. 17. Today, political machines use data consultants and expensive ads. In 19th century New York, Tammany Hall preferred a much simpler method: catch immigrants while they were tired, hungry, and disoriented. Operatives met incoming ships, welcomed Irish and German arrivals with food and assistance, and then rushed them through corrupt naturalization courts at absurd speed. A judge could turn someone into an American citizen almost immediately, which is already wild, but the machine did not stop there. These fresh new citizens were then marched straight to the polls and told exactly which candidate to support. It was politics run like an assembly line. Eat the meal, get the paper, cast the vote, next customer. Tammany Hall basically treated citizenship like a same-day service package. It was shameless, efficient, and deeply cynical, which in fairness does explain why it worked so well for so long in the first place. 18. American officials were terrified that poor immigrants would arrive with no money and end up needing public support, so inspectors demanded proof of financial stability. In practice, that often meant showing at least $25 in cash, which at the time was a very serious amount of money. Poor migrants, however, were not about to lose because of one rule and one banknote, so they got creative. Groups pooled what little money they had or borrowed a single bill from someone wealthier. One immigrant would flash the cash, pass inspection, and then secretly feed that exact same money back through a fence or barrier to the next person in line. Then the next, then the next. It was a low-budget masterpiece of coordination. The government thought it was testing individual solvency, but really it was measuring collective resourcefulness. Bureaucracy showed up with rules. Immigrants showed up with teamwork and a traveling $25 bill. 19. People tend to imagine the earliest border fence between the United States and Mexico as the first big move to stop human migration. In reality, the original problem was much less dramatic and somehow much funnier. Cows. In 1911, one of the first serious barriers along the border was built to stop Mexican cattle from bringing in the Texas fever tick, a parasite that threatened American herds. So the Department of Agriculture pushed for fencing in Southern California, and armed guards were sent out not to check passports, but to deal with livestock and livestock-related panic. The roots of modern border enforcement, at least in part, trace back to a giant anti-cow bug project. That is a wonderfully ridiculous origin story for something now surrounded by so much national drama. The early border crisis was not about ideology or migration. It was about ticks, cattle, and animals ignoring international boundaries with zero respect for government plans. 20. In 1917, border enforcement in El Paso took a dark and deeply humiliating turn when officials panicked about typhus coming from Mexico. Their answer was to force Mexican workers crossing the border to strip and undergo chemical baths. These were not gentle disinfecting showers. People were sprayed with mixtures that included soap, kerosene, and other toxic substances used to kill lice and insects. It was degrading, dangerous, and wildly abusive. Imagine being told the price of crossing a bridge for work was public humiliation and a coating of flammable chemicals. That is not public health. That is bureaucratic madness with a hose. Then, a 17-year-old Mexican girl named Carmelita Torres refused to submit, urged others to resist, and helped ignite a major riot that shut the crossing down. In one moment of defiance, she became a local legend for doing what officials clearly had not done: recognizing that the policy was disgusting. 21. Bananas caused genuine confusion at Ellis Island, which feels impossible until you remember many newcomers from Eastern and Southern Europe had never seen one before. Workers handed them out as a welcome snack, probably expecting gratitude and maybe a smile. Instead, some hungry arrivals stared at the strange yellow object, shrugged, and bit straight through the peel. Which, honestly, is a reasonable mistake when nobody has explained tropical fruit to you and your brain is running on exhaustion. So there they were, chewing bitter skin and wondering why Americans were so enthusiastic about this dry, unpleasant thing. Somewhere nearby, officials had to act out the concept of peeling a banana to a crowd of strangers using pure pantomime. It must have looked like a frantic theater performance called No, Not Like That. All because the New World greeted people with a fruit that came with packaging nobody knew was not edible. 22. In 1911, the United States government decided that racism apparently needed charts, measurements, and an oversized research budget. The Dillingham Commission released a gigantic 41-volume study on immigrants, and instead of sticking to economics or labor, it embraced junk science with remarkable confidence. Researchers literally measured the skulls of Italians, Slavs, and other newcomers, trying to prove that certain groups were biologically inferior or more prone to crime. This was the era of phrenology and related nonsense, when officials acted as if a person's moral worth could be found by examining head shape like they were choosing a melon at a market. The government spent real money publishing this garbage as serious analysis. It dressed prejudice up in scientific language and called it objective truth. That combination of authority, bad science, and xenophobia did real damage, all because powerful people wanted racism to wear a lab coat. 23. One of the most popular immigration myths says Ellis Island inspectors casually butchered European family names because they were lazy, confused, or could not spell. It is a great story, except it is mostly wrong. Inspectors at Ellis Island usually worked from passenger manifests already prepared before the ship even arrived, and many of them were multilingual professionals who knew exactly what they were reading. The real trouble often started back in European ports, such as Bremen or Naples, where overworked clerks wrote names down however they thought they sounded. In crowded, noisy docks, with accents flying everywhere and ticketing lines backed up, accuracy was not always the star of the show. So by the time families reached New York, the damage might already be on paper. In other words, the legendary Ellis Island name change was often not an American misunderstanding. It was a preloaded clerical mess from the departure side. 24. Before World War I, entering the United States could be shockingly simple compared with the bureaucratic obstacle course people expect today. For much of the 19th century, there was no passport requirement, no visa system, no mountain of forms, and no giant interview process. You bought passage on a ship, survived an often miserable journey, arrived in a port like New York or Boston, answered a few basic questions, and stepped into your new life. That was basically it. As long as you were not seen as obviously dangerous or likely to become a public burden, the government was often willing to let you in and move on. America wanted workers, settlers, railroad builders, factory hands, and people with energy. The whole setup looked less like modern border control and more like a chaotic open door with occasional suspicion. For a while, immigration policy was astonishingly loose by any standard we would recognize now. 25. Long before dating apps, awkward blind dates, or romantic algorithms pretending to know your soul, the struggling Jamestown colony came up with a colonial-era solution to loneliness that was both practical and deeply weird. In 1619, the Virginia Company arranged for 90 unmarried English women to come to Virginia because too many male colonists were miserable, unstable, and considering leaving. The company had figured out that settlements work better when people have reasons to stay that are stronger than disease and swamp. But this was not charity. Any man who wanted to marry one of these women had to reimburse the company with 120 pounds of tobacco, which was a huge amount. So yes, one of the earliest marriage markets in English America ran partly on leaf-based payment. Romantic commitment helped save the colony, but it came wrapped in the unmistakable tone of a business transaction disguised as destiny. 26. When the United States Border Patrol was created in 1924, you might assume its first mission was cracking down on unauthorized migration. That sounds logical, which is probably why history immediately swerves in another direction. The country was in the middle of Prohibition, and Washington was far more obsessed with alcohol than with people crossing the line. So many early Border Patrol agents spent their time chasing smugglers, hauling whiskey, tequila, and other forbidden fun across the borders with Canada and Mexico. Instead of focusing mainly on migrants, these officers often became desert and backroad liquor hunters. The federal government had basically assembled a new enforcement agency and then used it as a heavily armed anti-party squad. High-speed pursuits, hidden shipments, confiscated booze, endless panic over people drinking the wrong liquid at the wrong time. Early border enforcement was, in no small part, powered by national obsession with stopping happy hour. 27. In 1798, President John Adams was deeply worried that foreigners, especially in a time of conflict with France, might threaten the young republic. So he signed the Alien Enemies Act, which gave the president sweeping power to arrest, detain, or deport male citizens of hostile nations during wartime without anything resembling modern due process. It was one of those laws that arrives wearing the costume of security while carrying the spirit of a power grab. The astonishing part is not just that it existed, but that it never truly disappeared. Congress never repealed it. So, a law created in the age of powdered wigs, horse travel, and handwritten letters still technically survives in American law. That is not a historical footnote. That is a legal zombie with 18th century origins and modern consequences. The idea that such an old emergency weapon still lingers is both fascinating and more than a little unsettling. 28. If you want a truly awkward conversation about illegal border crossing, American history offers a brutal twist. Some of the most aggressive early border violators were Americans moving into Mexican Texas. In the early 19th century, Texas belonged to Mexico, but settlers from the United States kept flooding in anyway, often ignoring Mexican immigration restrictions completely. And because irony clearly wanted a starring role, many of those settlers also brought enslaved people with them, even though Mexico had abolished slavery. So while modern politicians love dramatic speeches about unlawful entry, the foundation of Texas involved Americans doing exactly that on a large scale. Mexico tried to stop it with laws and military outposts, but enforcement never fully worked. The whole story turns today's border rhetoric inside out. Before the complaints, before the slogans, before the cable news outrage, there were already Americans crossing southward illegally and acting like the rules did not apply to them. 29. Walking through Ellis Island was stressful enough without being silently judged by doctors who treated your body like a possible problem waiting to be labeled. As immigrants climbed the big staircase, medical officers watched closely for signs of illness, weakness, or disability. If they spotted something concerning, they used chalk to mark the person's clothing with letters that could change everything. An E suggested eye trouble. An H hinted at heart issues. An X could mean suspected mental deficiency. These were not harmless notes. They were warning signals that could send someone into further inspection and possibly toward deportation. Families knew exactly how dangerous that chalk was, which is why some desperately tried to rub the marks off before the next checkpoint. Think about that for a second. One quick stroke of white chalk on a coat could outweigh hope, money, plans, and years of dreaming. For many people, that tiny letter felt bigger than the country itself. 30. Coming to America was not just physically exhausting. It also came with a government entry fee that hit poor immigrants like a slap to the wallet before they even bought lunch. Starting in the late 19th century, the federal government imposed a head tax on each immigrant arriving by ship. At first, it was 50 cents, which was not pleasant but still manageable. Then officials kept raising it. By 1907, it climbed to $4. Later, it reached $8. For struggling families scraping together passage money, those increases were brutal. The government was essentially charging desperate newcomers for the privilege of being inspected. It turned immigration into a kind of financial ambush. Survive the voyage, reach the harbor, and then get billed at the door. There is something especially grim about demanding an admission fee from people who often arrived with little more than luggage, hope, and the dangerous belief that the hardest part was already over. 31. Most people assume constitutional protections work the same everywhere once you're inside the United States. Then border law enters the chat and things get weird. Thanks to a legal framework dating back to the 1950s, Border Patrol exercises unusual authority within 100 miles of any external boundary, including the coastline. Inside that giant zone, agents can operate checkpoints and inspect vehicles with powers that feel far more intrusive than many people realize. The shocking part is how much of the population lives there. Roughly 65% of Americans fall within that range, which means huge parts of the country, including all of Florida and much of the East Coast, sit inside this expanded enforcement space. So the so-called border zone is not some narrow strip out in the desert. It covers major cities and everyday communities. It is an invisible legal shadow that most people live under without even noticing. 32. Benjamin Franklin is usually remembered as the witty genius with the kite, the printing press, and the founding father aura. But in the 1750s, he also sounded a lot like a very irritated modern commenter, panicking about immigrants ruining the neighborhood. Franklin was deeply upset by the growing number of German immigrants in Pennsylvania. He complained that they were ignorant, backward, and unwilling to adopt English culture. He worried they would reproduce too quickly, dominate elections, and transform the colony beyond recognition. In other words, he was doing the classic routine of treating newcomers like an existential threat to civilization because they spoke differently and ate unfamiliar food. It is almost funny until you realize how familiar the argument still sounds. One of the great champions of early America was out here basically having a public meltdown over Germans, proving that anti-immigrant panic is not new at all. It is practically woven into the national wallpaper. U.S. immigration history is basically panic, hypocrisy, and bureaucracy in a trench coat. So now I want the real argument in the comments. Which fact was the most insane? And what outrageous immigration story did we leave out that absolutely deserved a spot here? Drop it below. Like the video, subscribe, and stick around for more history acting completely unhinged.